So I hope when you came to services this morning, you all got this ekru handout, and that you can easily pull it out. Craig Kazin is here to share with you. By now, you know my theme for the holidays is listening. And what I want to do this morning is tell you a few stories and look at a few texts from the Torah and Haftarah reading as examples of not such good listening. But first, I want to tell you a story about the Hebrew and Yiddish writer and Zionist leader Shmirayahu Lavin. The truth of the matter is, I thought that was just a street in Jerusalem. I didn't realize it was a person until, 10, 15 years ago. But he would tell a transformative incident that took place when he was about 10 years old. It happened in Eastern Europe. He received a gift of his very own shofar. And as Rosh Hashanah approached, he was so excited to practice sounding the shofar. But he tried really hard, and I could so relate to this poor child. During the whole month of Elul, he tried practicing his shofar. He would spend at least an hour a day holding it in various positions, trying to get a little sound out of the shofar, and he failed miserably. Sometime, if you're lucky, I could show you what that looks like. The day before Rosh Hashanah, as he was practicing outside his home, a Russian farmer came by and said, "Hey, what's that?" And so he took it and he explained it to the farmer. And the farmer said, "Can I try?" And he took the shofar and he held it up to his lips. And out came the best and the longest Tekiah Gedolah that poor little Shmirayahu Lavin would ever hear. And he raced back to his teacher and he was choking back the tears and he said, "It's not fair. I spent the whole month trying to sound the shofar. And in comes the peasant farmer and he gets it the first time. He gets a beautiful sound." And his teacher reassured him and said, "The blessing that the person who sounds the shofar says before blowing the shofar is Lishmoa kol shofar. Blessed are you, God, for listening to the sound of the shofar." So even the shofar blower, even those folks, the mitzvah isn't about blowing the shofar, it's about hearing and listening. The trick isn't how to sound the shofar, although Steve, wherever you are, you did a fantastic job. The trick is listening. I love that story, maybe because I could just so relate to trying and just not being able to get it right. But I love that image and being told it's not the sound you get out, it's the listening that counts. And so I thought about that, and I thought about this holiday, High Holy Days in general, as being what I called in my computer listening boot camp. So for the last chunk of time, I've been looking for texts and stories about listening and hearing and paying close attention. And I put together a bunch of them here, and what I want us to do is look through the text. And the first text I want us to look at is actually so obvious, I don't mean to insult you that I used it. But there are many different ways to interpret the text, Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. The obvious one, which is the way we're taught, and which is the way I teach in the preschool, is I say Shema Yisrael means we Jews, we have one God. But the truth is there's another way to look at this line, and that is to say that there's a commandment, Shema Yisrael, and we're all Yisrael, and what's the commandment? The commandment is to listen or to pay attention. So I want to put it out there, those of you who come to our minyan, when you say the Shema, yes, it's about one God, but perhaps another way to say it is that it is about listening. My colleague, Rabbi Amy Eilberg, who is noteworthy on her own is also the first woman to be ordained as a conservative rabbi. And today she wrote a book in which she talks about conflict resolution, and she shared an interpretation of the second paragraph of the Shema that I want to share with you. So the second paragraph of the Shema, it's on your sheet, it's number 2, and it says, if you obey the commandments, then life is going to be good. And it says, and I will send rain on your land in its season, both autumn and spring rains. And it goes on to talk about how life could be good. But the text goes on and says in verse 16, be careful or you will be enticed to turn away and worship other gods, and God's anger will burn against you. So the second paragraph of the Shema talks about being rewarded for being obedient and being punished for disobeying God. So my colleague, Rabbi Amy Eilberg, who does this work on conflict resolution, offers a really interesting perspective on this text because she, like so many of us, struggles with this idea of reward and punishment from God. So she was doing a workshop with some 20 people or so, and she asked people to recall a time that they felt like they had been heard, that they felt like they'd been listened to deeply. And she asked people, how did you feel when you felt as though somebody heard you? And she said the response was, loved, whole, at peace, good. So then Rabbi Eilberg asked the opposite question, and she said, so what did you feel like when you wanted to be heard, but you weren't? And she says that the differences were stark. Some participants talked about ignoring a child's need for attention, and soon thereafter there would be a temper tantrum. Or how distracted or self-centered listening with an intimate partner evoked a storm of negative emotion. And all this leads Rabbi Eilberg to this really interesting reframing of the second paragraph of the Shema. My whole life until this summer, I read the second paragraph of the Shema and thought of it as reward and punishment for obedience to God. So she says, no, it's not true in meteorological terms. The puzzling passage predicted the dire consequences of poor listening. Relationally speaking, this is a description of life as it is. In other words, when it says, V'haya'im shamoa, if you listen, she says, when you listen, you feel whole and loved, and the people around you feel whole and loved, because you're modeling and you create a community of listeners. And she said, but when you don't listen, there are dire consequences. Not just for you, but for the people around you. So I thought that this was really an interesting way, and I wanted to share with you, Rabbi Eilberg doesn't just talk Torah and write Torah, she lives it. So I want to tell you what happened with Rabbi Eilberg and me. She and I are on many listservs together, but this was a listserv in which I wrote something that she didn't agree with. I won't bore you with the details of what it was about, but she wrote a response and it stung. I felt a dagger in my heart. And I wanted to write back and say, are you kidding me? But luckily I had some place to go, and so I just walked away from the computer. And by the time I got to my email, there was a note from Rabbi Eilberg in which she said, I feel like maybe I'd love to talk to you. I'm afraid my last email, which was to a listserv of people, could have been hurtful. Can we talk? So this happened like 3 days before we were getting married. So I said, do you mind
waiting until after the wedding? I just want to focus. She was all happy, of course. So in the middle of January, we finally had a Zoom conversation. And she asked me what I was thinking and what was on my mind and what propelled me to write what I wrote. And I explained it, and she listened. And I listened to her. And I felt good. When we hung up, she still believed what she believed. And I still believed what I believed. But I was seen and heard, and that felt okay. I could live with that. And so I was taken. It was after that conversation that I went and got Rabbi Eilberg's book, because I thought, this is a woman that walks the walk and doesn't just talk the talk. So what I want to do now is look through 3 or 4 more passages that we've read already, but I want to use them as examples of not such great behavior and one great example of wonderful behavior. So in our Haftarah this morning, I'm on the second page. It says source 3. I want to remind you about this man. His name was Elkanah. He had 2 wives, Peninnah and Hannah. And Peninnah had children, and Hannah didn't. And the text says that Hannah couldn't stand it, that she was really struggling. The infertility was really hard for her. She really wanted to be a mom. At the bottom of the page, I want you to read what Elkanah says. Hannah, why are you weeping? Why don't you eat? Why are you downtrodden? Am I not better to you than 10 sons? What's the matter with those questions? Are they questions of curiosity? I don't think so. He's actually scolding her. Aren't I better than 10 sons? He's giving her a pep talk. What are you getting so upset about? What's the terrible? I don't need you to have children. I just love you. But then, first of all, that's not what he says. And secondly, he doesn't act in an empathetic way, in that he doesn't even allow Hannah to be in pain. It's actually a very bad example. Even though I want to say I believe that Elkanah went to Hannah with love and that he cared. But he wasn't really listening to her. And there's an arrogance there, like, aren't I better to you than 10 sons? She wants to be a mother. Being a mother is not the same as being a wife. And so it's not possible that that exchange was a positive one. Poor Hannah had a rough day. And what I mean by that is not only did her husband not hear her, she goes to shul. And what happens in this instance is the priest at the time has these preconceived notions. Eli sees her, and instead of seeing her and being curious, what does he do? He sees this woman, and he thinks she's drunk. She's praying in her heart. Her lips were moving, but her voice was not. And Eli thought she was drunk, and he says to her, how long are you going to stay drunk? Put away your wine. Really? Can you imagine coming to shul and being so desperate and having, now I'm going to say, the rabbi rebuke you and accuse you? Like, it's terrible. If the first example was an example of listening in which it was scolding, in which it was insufficient, and it didn't come from curiosity, the second example that our Haftarah offers us is an example where you make these assumptions, and once you make the assumptions, then you can't listen. So if my colleague Amy Eilberg, Rabbi Eilberg, had made assumptions about me, she wouldn't have bothered to send an email. She would have dismissed me because, after all, she knew better. And she wouldn't have worried about our connection. Now, the truth is, I wanna redeem Eli. He goofed big time. But then when she says, no, I'm not drunk, I'm praying, he turns and says, go in peace, and may the God of Israel grant you what you've asked for. But first he attacked her. and then he took a step back. And in that regard, I want to say that was my interaction with Rabbi Eilberg. She first put out, but then she walked her walk, and she said, no, I want to talk and I want to hear. The last two examples I want us to look at are on the back of the page. The back of page, it says page 4 on the bottom. So you could not listen sometimes because you're making assumptions. You could not listen sometimes because you're just not listening because you want to move someone to where you want them to be. But tragedy can prevent listening as well. And I want you to imagine for a moment what happened in our Torah reading. Early the next morning, Abraham took some food and skin of water, and he gave them to Hagar, and he set them on her shoulders, and he sent her off with the boy. She went on her way and wandered in the desert. She ran out of water, and she was desperate. What did she do? She was so distraught. She didn't hold her son in focus. She went off and sat down about a bow shot away. She said, I can't watch this pain. I can't do it. And as she sat at the distance, she raised her voice and wept. Tragedy can sometimes make it impossible to listen. Okay. At least know that. At least know for yourself when you're in that place where it's so dark you can't listen. And maybe try. And be aware. And so these are all examples from our scriptural readings this week of bad listening this holiday. But then there's just my favorite, which comes, and of course it would be God who would model good listening. Because what happens is Hagar puts her son down, and she goes off, and she's crying at a distance. And the Torah text says, Vayishma Elohim et kol hanahar. God heard the cries of the child. And the most interesting line there is God says, Ba'asher husham. God heard the voice of the boy in the place where he is. And why is that such wonderful modeling? Because he was in the moment with the child. And what does that mean for us? Sometimes there are people who we don't like or who rub us the wrong way. Or we know their past, and we know that in the past they've done ... Ba'asher husham means be present for them in the moment. Yesterday, or 2 months ago, and 2 years ago, isn't what we're talking about. It's to be in the here and now. And yes, a grudge, for example, or a behavior that someone exhibited 3 years ago, if you want to listen to that person, be in the moment. And that's what God does. And by the way, remember Ishmael, he was he and his brother Abraham didn't always get along so well. But that's not what this moment was about. This moment was about a boy who was crying. This moment was about a boy who was thirsty and whose mother wasn't around. And God heard him. And God responded. So I wanted to look at many different instances from our text because I think they're illustrative of what we can be doing to listen more, to hear better, to respond more attentively. And I want to conclude by telling you just one last story, and this story is about Rabbi Jacobson, who I think most of you know. Rabbi Jacobson is, she's been here for forever. She lives in Amherst, but she's the chaplain at the JGS, and she's a very dear friend. The truth is, Rabbi Jacobson and I hardly agree on a thing. Like when we sit down together to talk, we shouldn't talk, on one level, we shouldn't talk about world issues because we're two sides of a coin. But what I love about talking with Rabbi Jacobson is she's genuinely curious to hear what I'm thinking and what guides my framing of the situation. When she asks me a question, she doesn't say, "What are you thinking?" She says, "I'm curious to know what brought you to that conclusion." And she listens first, and she wants to understand. And never is she trying to change my mind. She respects me. And she says, "You are a cherished colleague, so if you believe this, if you see this way, I want to know what you're seeing, because I don't." I think that's why I love Rabbi Jacobson as I do, because I feel heard, I feel seen, I feel whole. I gave you 2 examples of colleagues of whom I've had different conversations. And I actually want to end with a prayer. My prayer is that I have a colleague in a synagogue somewhere who's telling a story about me. And they're saying, I don't know if it's true, I hope so. I'm hoping somebody is saying, that Rabbi Walk, I never agree with her, but she wants to hear what I'm thinking. And I hope the people who I spend my life with know, and I hope I walk the walk the way Rabbi Eilberg and Rabbi Jacobson do. And what I really hope is that you'll join me on the walk as best you can.